Hamish Macbeth and the New Year's Eve murder. On a storm-dark Hogmanay in Loughdub, old grudges simmer as the bells ring in the new year, and one man's sudden death turns celebration into suspicion. For when a village chooses sides too quickly, Hamish Macbeth knows the truth will not come quietly. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? And if you enjoy settling into these Highland mysteries, subscribe and make this part of your nightly ritual. Only 11% are subscribed while 89% aren't. Your support truly means a lot. Hamish Macbeth trudged back into Loughdub with the kind of dull weariness that came after a day spent filling out forms no one read. A thin drizzle clung to his hair and made his old jacket look even scruffier. Lugs padded beside him, ears flat, as if the dog blamed Hamish for the weather. Something was wrong the moment they reached the square. People stood about in little knots, talking too quickly, pretending they were not watching each other. Even from a distance, Hamish could hear Mrs. Wellington's voice carrying like a trumpet. That was never a good sign. Inside Patel's shop, the air was warm but sour with gossip. Crofter Alec McLean blocked the biscuit shelf, waving his big hands as if shooing away invisible flies. "Exclusive," Alec said, nearly spitting the word. "Exclusive to who? Not a soul from Loughdub, that's who. That flashy Englishman thinks we're scenery." Mrs. Wellington, turning over a tin of shortbread she had no intention of buying, said Hamish ought to put a stop to it. Patel kept stacking tins as if he hoped to hide behind them. Hamish said it was hardly a police matter. He wished at once he had kept his mouth shut. Alec fixed him with a look that was far too knowing. "Aye, you'd say that," he muttered. "You've aye had a soft spot for the hotel folk." Hamish felt a slow heat rise in his ears. It was unfair, but half the village looked ready to believe it. Outside, drizzle gave way to heavier rain, and by evening the gutters around the Kirk Hall ran like small brown rivers. The meeting inside was already a mess by the time Hamish arrived. People had not come to discuss anything. They had come to accuse. The traditional Hogmanay ceilidh had been shoved into a cramped side room so the hotel's paying guests could have the main hall, and the insult stung more than the rain. The hotel manager stood stiffly near the front, arms folded, doing a poor job of looking confident. When someone shouted that the village was being treated like hired help, the manager protested that the booking had been made months ago. Another villager yelled that Loughdub did not take instructions from outsiders. Hamish tried to calm them, his voice thin in the noise. He said something vague about the hall being a shared community resource. It was meant to sound neutral, but it came out sounding like support for the hotel. The hall went quiet in an ugly way. Alec McLean stepped forward, face red, and said Hamish should stop taking the side of strangers. "You're always on their side, Hamish Macbeth," he said. A murmur of agreement floated around the room like midges. Hamish felt himself shrink. He wished he could vanish into the coat rack. Lugs nudged his leg, sensing the tension, but the dog's presence made Hamish feel worse, not better. Even his own dog thought something was wrong. The door opened sharply, and in swept Crispin Vale, wearing a long coat far too stylish for Highland weather. He had the smooth face of a man who thought he looked important. He smiled as if blessing everyone with his presence. "I do hope I'm not interrupting some quaint local custom," he said. His voice carried the smugness of someone used to hearing his own jokes on television. Harriet Vale trailed behind him, looking as if she wanted to disappear into the wallpaper. Lydia, Crispin's PA, followed with a clipboard and a pinched expression. Crispin announced that he hoped the Hogmanay spirit would triumph. He said tourists brought money. He said the village should celebrate its own charm. Hamish thought Crispin sounded like a brochure. The man carried a bundle of rolled papers under his arm, old land maps by the look of them. Hamish wondered why Crispin had them at a community meeting, then dismissed the thought. The whole evening felt pointless. When Crispin turned to leave, Lugs growled. Crispin only laughed and said he rather liked robust animals. Harriet murmured something that sounded like an apology to no one in particular. They stepped back into the rain, and the door swung shut on another half-hearted joke from Crispin. After that, the meeting dissolved into muttering. Villagers drifted away in clusters, each group glancing at the others with suspicion. The rain hammered on the roof, loud enough to drown any hope of sense. Hamish made the mistake of offering to help tidy up. Mrs. Wellington told him in a tight voice that the villagers could manage without police interference. She then handed him a bin bag with exaggerated politeness. He filled it, feeling like a scolded schoolboy. By the time he and Lugg stepped out onto the path, The village looked split right down the middle. Some saw the hotel as a threat, some as an opportunity, but all of them now saw Hamish as someone who had taken the wrong side. He told himself it would blow over. It never did. Not in Loch Dhu. On the road home, the rain eased, though the cold deepened. Hamish tried not to think about the glare Alec had given him, or the way Harriet's eyes had darted nervously toward Crispin, or the old maps tucked under that man's arm. It was all just Hogmanay nerves, he told himself. People were touchy this time of year. Still, a dull worry settled in his stomach. When Loch Dhu turned against itself, it never did so quietly. At the station, the peat fire smoked badly. Hamish sat on the edge of the worn chair, dripping onto the floor, and Lugs flopped down with a sigh as dramatic as any human's. The dog's ears twitched at every distant sound, as if expecting more trouble. Hamish stroked the rough fur behind Lugs's neck. "Maybe it'll sort itself out," he muttered. But the village had already made its choice. The New Year's Eve party would go ahead at the hotel, and now it was no longer just a celebration. It was an insult. Loch Dhu would remember it that way for years. Hamish, without meaning to, had helped fix the insult in place. He looked into the dim room, thinking briefly of tea, then deciding he could not be bothered. He felt the kind of tired that had nothing to do with weather or hours. The night pressed close to the windows. Somewhere up near the lodge, Crispin Vale was no doubt planning another grand speech, another joke at the village's expense. Hamish tried not to imagine it. He banked the fire and shut the station door against the wind. Lugs watched him with solemn eyes. Hamish did not say it aloud, but he knew the truth. Hogmanay had not even begun, and already something was wrong in Loch Dhu. It would only get worse. Later that night, when he reported for the police presence the manager had insisted on, Hamish Macbeth knew the night had already gone wrong the moment he stepped into the great hall of Tommel Castle Hotel. The place glittered with sequins and cheap perfume, and he felt like a scarecrow someone had dragged in to amuse the guests. The manager had insisted on a police presence for the tourists, as if Hamish were part of the entertainment. Lugs slunk at his side, nose wrinkling at the strong smell of hairspray and whiskey. The villagers had been pushed into the small sidebar, where the ceiling was low and the heater wheezed. They stood about in stiff groups, drinking faster than was wise. Hamish caught a few looks aimed at him, none friendly. Someone muttered that he should be ashamed for supporting the hotel. He pretended not to hear. In the main hall, Crispin Vale's crowd looked as though they had stepped out of a glossy magazine. Bright clothes, bright smiles, bright, foolish laughter. A group of men in tuxedos toasted the wild Highlands, sounding as if they were mocking it. Hamish stood near a pillar, trying to look as though he belonged. He wished he were back in Loch Dhu in his quiet station with a mug of tea. Harriet Vale appeared beside him, pale in the odd lighting. She looked like a woman trying not to be noticed and failing. "Constable," she said, touching his sleeve lightly, "you'll keep an eye on Crispin, won't you? He likes to provoke people." Hamish said he'd try, though he knew Crispin would do whatever he pleased. Before he could ask more, Crispin strode past with Lydia, his PA. Crispin carried a whiskey glass and a smug expression. He was muttering about contracts and those Crofts. Lydia hissed at him to lower his voice. Alec McLean lingered nearby, shoulders tense, whiskey breath strong. Hamish called his name, but Alec pushed past without a word. The band struck up the noisy lead-in to the countdown. People packed into the hall. The lights dimmed. Not that they had needed dimming. The room already looked as though someone had drained it of good sense. Hamish was jostled by elbows and perfume. Lugs barked once, irritated by stamping feet. At 10 seconds to midnight, the fairy lights flickered. Hamish assumed it was the hotel trying to be dramatic. At the stroke of the bells, the hall went dark. A shriek rose, then laughter, then more shrieking as people tripped over their own excitement. Someone elbowed Hamish in the ribs hard enough to make him grunt. The lights snapped back. Crispin Vale, who had been standing front and centre, was nowhere to be seen. Lydia looked startled and then annoyed, as if Crispin had vanished just to spite her. Harriet pushed toward Hamish, breathless. "He left," she said. "I don't know where he's gone. Please help me find him." She hurried past him toward a side door. Lugs trotted forward eagerly, sensing trouble. Hamish followed them into a narrow service corridor that smelled of polish and damp stone. The corridor bent left toward the library, a room few guests ever used. Harriet reached the door first. She opened it with a trembling hand. Crispin Vale sat slumped in a leather chair by the cold fireplace. His head lolled at an odd angle. A shattered whiskey glass glittered on the rug beside his foot. His hand still held a party cracker, the paper limp between his fingers. His face had a greyish cast. Harriet gasped, and her knees bent slightly as if she might collapse. Hamish steadied her arm. He felt a hard thump of his own heart and wished someone else had found the man first. "It might be his heart," Harriet whispered. "He's had trouble before." Hamish wished he knew more about hearts. "Maybe a seizure," he muttered, hoping it sounded sensible. Luggs whined and backed away from the chair, tail tucked. The hotel manager arrived, puffing. "What's this? He must have fainted. It's the excitement." The man darted a quick, frightened look at the guests behind him. "We don't want panic. We'll keep this quiet until we know more." Hamish knew he should insist on clearing the room and calling Strathbane at once. Instead, he hesitated. He disliked creating scenes, and the manager was already pushing guests back into the corridor with smooth, false assurance. Someone suggested getting Crispin walked about for air, but Harriet snapped that no one was to touch him. The manager nodded rapidly, pretending he had said so himself. Hamish tried to look like a calm expert. He felt like a fool. Harriet knelt beside her husband and touched his sleeve gently, as if afraid he might wake and jeer at her. "He wasn't well," she murmured, not quite talking to Hamish. "He shouldn't have been drinking." Hamish looked at the broken glass. A faint smell of something sharp lingered, though he could not place it. He decided it was from the whiskey. The room felt too warm now, despite the dead fireplace. His collar itched. "Let's get the hotel doctor," the manager said. "It'll be nothing." Harriet stared at him with a strange, hollow expression. "Nothing," she repeated. "Yes." The guests in the corridor whispered loudly, the way people do when trying and failing to be discreet. A woman in a sequined dress asked if the Highlands always had such poor electrical wiring. Someone else complained about the timing of the blackout. Hamish said nothing. He wanted them all gone. When the doctor finally arrived from one of the better rooms upstairs, he bent over Crispin for a moment, barely touching him. Then he gave a small shake of his head. "He's dead," he said. "Been dead a few minutes." Harriet let out a sound like a breath cut in half. Hamish felt a cold tug in his stomach. He had hoped Crispin would yet produce some cutting remark and stand up. No such luck. By the time the clock in the corridor chimed 12:08, Hamish realized he had already made a mistake. He had let the hotel manager control the scene. He had allowed people to wander about. Evidence, if any existed, was probably smudged or already gone. The villagers in the cramped bar heard the news soon enough. Their murmurs turned ugly. Some said Crispin had dropped dead because of his own foolishness. Others said someone had helped him along. Lochdu's grudges drifted into the castle like smoke. Back in the library, Hamish found himself staring at the crooked angle of Crispin's head. It did not look natural, but he felt too ignorant to argue with the doctor. He told himself that people died in odd positions all the time. It was a weak thought, and he knew it. The hotel manager shut the door as if closing a cupboard. "We'll handle this delicately," he said, "for the sake of the guests." Hamish nodded, though he knew he had already lost control of the situation. He stroked Luggs absently. The dog pressed close to his leg, uneasy. Midnight had come and gone. Hogmanay had its first death. The rest of the night would be worse. Hamish felt it in the stale air of the corridor, in the half-heard gossip, in Harriet's white face. He had called it a seizure. He had believed it. That, he suspected, would cost him dearly. The morning began badly, which did not surprise Hamish Macbeth. Dirty snow slumped against the station steps like something abandoned, and his own head felt thick, though he had drunk nothing stronger than weak tea the night before. The telephone rang far too early. It was the manager from Tommel Castle, sounding breathless and annoyed. "You'd better come," he said. "There's been a development." He hung up before Hamish could ask what sort of development. That was always a bad sign. Hamish drove up to the hotel with Luggs beside him. The dog sat stiffly as if bracing for trouble. The roads were coated in a thin crust of ice, the sort of ice that promised to get worse before it got better. When Hamish reached the hotel, he found Harriet Vale sitting in the lounge, straight-backed and pale, with a doctor from Strathbane standing beside her. The doctor had the pinched look of a man who disliked being called out on holidays. The doctor cleared his throat when Hamish approached. "Poison," he said. "Not a doubt of it. In the whiskey. Fast-acting. Taken shortly before midnight." His tone suggested it was Hamish's fault for not noticing poison at once, as if every constable ought to be an expert in rare toxins. Hamish felt a hot flush crawl up his neck. He remembered how he had allowed the manager to tidy the room, to gather the glasses, to move the body, all in the name of avoiding fuss. Foolish. Harriet's hands were clasped too tightly in her lap. She looked at Hamish only once, and the look was enough. It said he had failed her, though she did not speak the words aloud. He turned away, pretending to study a patch of damp wallpaper. Before Hamish could gather his thoughts, Blair arrived. The door banged open so hard it hit the wall. Blair stalked in, red-faced from cold and whisky both. "So," he said, loud enough for the tourist to hear, "you wrote it off as a heart attack, Macbeth? You didn't think to secure the scene?" Anderson hurried in behind him, notebook already poised like a weapon. Hamish muttered that nobody had suggested foul play at the time. It sounded weak even to him. Blair snorted. "You'd miss a murder under your own nose," he said. "Probably too busy petting that dog." Luggs growled softly, which only made Blair sneer wider. Anderson scribbled it all down, looking eager, as if hoping Blair might throw Hamish out on the spot. Several villagers had gathered in the small lounge, watching the exchange with sharp, hungry interest. Blair turned on them. "One of you did this," he announced, "and I'll not be coddling you the way your pet constable does." The villagers bristled. They disliked Blair, but they liked the idea of Hamish failing even less. Lydia, Crispin's PA, stepped forward with tears balanced carefully in her eyes. She seemed the sort who practiced her emotions in a mirror. "Crispin was threatened," she said. "Alec McLean said he'd make him pay if he tried to take that Croft land. And Mrs. Vale told the constable beforehand that Crispin was stirring trouble. She tried to warn him." Lydia's voice turned sharp. He ignored her. Harriet stared down at her hands, not denying it. Hamish felt another twist of shame. "It was Hogmanay," he said quietly. "Folks say things." It was a poor defence. Blair seized on it. "Alec McLean," he barked. "Of course. A drunk with a grudge. Perfect." He turned to Anderson. "Fetch him. Now." Anderson rushed off as if delighted to finally be useful. Hamish tried to protest that Alec was foolish but not violent. Blair cut him off. "Spare me your village loyalties," he said. "I'm building a proper case." "We've cleaned the glasses already," the hotel manager said, trying to sound helpful. "Didn't want the guests seeing, well, anything upsetting." Blair rounded on him next. "You what?" The man shrank a little. They were cluttering the bar. A tray of glasses now sat drying near the counter. One had a faint brown smear along the rim. No one could explain it. Blair declared it evidence, though he did not bother to bag it. Hamish eyed the smear, wondering if it was lipstick or something else entirely, but he knew he had lost the right to ask questions. Feeling useless, Hamish wandered toward the library corridor. A small muddy streak darkened the carpet near the door. He crouched to look. It was peat, not hotel soil. Someone with peat on their boots had gone to the library after midnight. Before he could say so, Blair barked at him from behind. "Macbeth, stop crawling on the floor, you've done enough damage." Hamish stood. He did not mention the peat. If Blair ignored it, he would look careless. If Hamish insisted, Blair might twist it into a new accusation against Alec. Better to say nothing for now. The villagers in the lounge shifted uneasily. They could smell trouble, and they wanted it to settle anywhere but near them. Mrs. Wellington said tartly, "I could have told you Crispin would come to no good end." Patel whispered that she ought to keep such talk to herself. She ignored him. Lydia dabbed her eyes again. "Alec hated Crispin," she insisted. "Everyone knows it." A crofter near the window muttered, "Plenty hated him." Blair seized upon the comment like a terrier spotting a rat. "Names," he demanded. "Give me names." The crofter turned his face to the window and pretended not to hear. Blair swore under his breath. Harriet rose from her chair and said quietly, "My husband was difficult, but not wicked." No one answered her. Even Hamish had no words that wouldn't sound foolish. Anderson returned, breathless, reporting that Alec was not at home. Blair smirked. "Running," he said. "Always a sign of guilt." Hamish knew Alec was likely still half drunk in a neighbour's shed, avoiding his wife, but Blair would not believe it. A tourist couple wandered into the lounge at the worst possible moment, asking if breakfast was still being served. Blair shouted at them until they fled. Harriet winced. The manager wrung his hands. Hamish realised the shape of Blair's case was already fixed. Alec, drunk and angry, poisoning the Englishman out of spite. It fit too neatly, too easily. But Hamish had given Blair every excuse to believe it. He had bungled the scene. He had believed Harriet's first explanation. He had let fear of fuss override sense. Blair clapped Hamish on the shoulder. Hard enough to sting. "You'll give a full statement," he said. "Try not to leave out whatever else you missed." Hamish said nothing. Words would make it worse. Outside, dirty snow slid from the roof in slow, heavy chunks. The cold bit at his ears. Lugs pressed against his leg, uneasy. Hamish stood for a long moment, the hotel door shutting behind him with a smug click. He had made his first mistake last night. Now Blair had turned it into a noose for Alec. And Hamish, to his disgust, could not yet say Blair was wrong. By late morning the weather was already wrong. Rain slapped the windows of the station as if trying to get inside, and Hamish Macbeth felt a dull heaviness in his stomach that had nothing to do with breakfast. Word had gone round Lochdu faster than he could have driven it himself. Crispin Vale murdered at Hogmanay. The villagers had not waited for facts. They never did. Lugs whined at the door, impatient. Hamish took his coat and stepped out into the sideways rain. It hit him with such force that he almost turned back. Instead, he trudged toward Patel's shop, because trouble always brewed there first. Inside, the place was packed. Queues trailed down the aisles. Wet coats dripped on the floor. Mrs. Wellington had taken up position near the tinned goods, delivering her opinions loudly enough to be heard from the doorway. "Alec McLean's a brute," she said. "Always has been. Folk forget too quickly. He's got a temper like a kicked bull." Mrs. McLean, Alec's sister, snapped round so fast her scarf nearly strangled her. "You watch your mouth," she hissed. "You're blaming the poor man because it suits the hotel." She refused to look at Hamish, which told him plenty. Patel tried to smile at Hamish, but even that looked strained. "Maybe you talk to them, Constable," he whispered. "They are making my customers nervous." "They are your customers," Hamish said. "You calm them." Patel pretended not to hear. People in Lochdu were very good at pretending not to hear. Hamish squeezed through the crush, lugs at his heel. Everyone stared at him as if he'd arrived to take sides publicly. He had no intention of taking sides, but that never stopped anyone from assuming he had. Outside, the rain was worse. It blew straight under his collar. He made his way to the post office, where the postmistress looked as sour as the weather. She leaned across the counter the moment he entered. "I saw them," she said. "Him and that PA, arguing about money. 3 days before Hogmanay. You'll no get her to admit it." Hamish asked what exactly she'd heard, though he doubted much. The postmistress waved her hand vaguely. "Words. Sharp ones. And he stormed out without paying for his stamps. That tells you something." It did not tell Hamish anything except that Crispin was rude, but he nodded as if impressed. The postmistress seemed satisfied and returned to sorting letters with smug energy. From there he trudged to the Kirk Hall. The decorations were still hanging, limp and damp, as if embarrassed to be seen. The minister was taking them down one paper chain at a time, muttering. When Hamish approached, the minister let out a long breath. "That man bullied us," he said. "Told the committee our Saleys belonged in a broom cupboard. Called us a backwater. I would have reported him myself if he hadn't died first." Hamish tried to ask for specifics, but the minister only repeated that Crispin had been a menace. Luggs sniffed the fallen decorations and sneezed. By midday, Hamish felt more confused than informed. Every door he knocked on produced another story, none of which helped. People did not want to give him facts. They wanted him to confirm what they already believed. Worse, several doors did not open at all. Villagers who used to thrust tea at him suddenly had errands, headaches, or husbands sleeping off cold remedies. When he reached Alec McLean's cottage, the tension inside was obvious before anyone spoke. Hamish knocked. The chain rattled but did not fully release. Alec's wife peered through the gap, eyes red from crying or anger, likely both. "I'm here to ask," Hamish began. "You weren't there for us last night," she said. Her voice was flat. That made it worse. "You believed him over your own folk. We'll talk when you remember who you're meant to serve." She shut the door gently, which somehow stung more than a slam. The chain clicked back into place. Luggs whimpered, picking up the angry edge behind the door. Hamish stood there feeling foolish until the cold forced him to move. He tried 2 more houses. One crofter claimed to know nothing, though Hamish had seen the man talking fiercely in Patel's queue earlier. Another insisted Crispin had been perfectly pleasant and that the villagers were exaggerating. The man's wife rolled her eyes behind him, contradicting the story with a single look. Lochdu could not even agree on its own lies. By late afternoon, the rain had soaked Hamish through. He considered going back to the station, but a figure called his name from a sagging gate. Old Mrs. Carmichael waved him over with a hand like a claw. "You'll no get sense from that lot," she said. "They're all hiding something. But I saw something you'll want." Hamish doubted that, but he stepped closer. Mrs. Carmichael's garden smelled of wet soil and old onions. She leaned in, lowering her voice as if the weeds might tattle. "That wife of his," she said, "Harriet. I saw her at 5 minutes to the bells, standing on the terrace, alone, staring toward the village, glass in her hand." "It was a party," Hamish said. "She wasn't partying, and him, Crispin, he wasn't with her. I saw him slip out with that PA woman, Lydia. They went by the service corridor. Looked like they didn't want to be seen." Hamish rubbed his cold nose. "That's gossip," Mrs. Carmichael sniffed. "Everything's gossip, till it isn't." He gave a non-committal nod and left. He had no patience for Mrs. Carmichael's theatrics, and Harriet standing alone did not seem important. People often stepped away at parties. He dismissed it as jealousy. Mrs. Carmichael had always disliked well-dressed women. The wind hit him hard as he rounded the corner back toward the square. Rain blew straight off the loch and slapped his face. Lochdu streets were empty now. People had gone inside to argue with their families instead of their neighbours. Lug stayed close to his leg, ears twitching. Even the dog sensed that the village had turned sour. Hamish felt it too, a heaviness in the air, like the moment before a sheep kicks. At the station he hung his wet coat, though it still dripped steadily on the floor. He sat on the edge of his chair and thought about the day. Everything he'd heard pulled in a different direction. Lydia quarrelling, Alec threatening, Crispin insulting the minister, Harriet standing alone. None of it formed a straight path, but one thing was clear. Lochdu had chosen sides and Hamish was not on the right one. He scratched Lugs behind the ear. The dog leaned into him with a low sigh. Outside, the wind battered the windows again. Hamish stared at the darkening square. Somehow he had lost the easy loyalty he'd always relied on, and Crispin's death, instead of answering anything, had turned the whole village into a nest of secrets and slights. He felt it settling on him like damp wool, uncomfortable, heavy, and not likely to lift soon. The next morning, by the time Hamish Macbeth stepped into Strathbane station, he could feel trouble waiting for him. The air smelled of stale coffee and Blair's aftershave, a combination that always meant trouble. A uniformed constable nodded him toward interview room 2 with the sort of pitying look Hamish disliked. Lugs wasn't allowed inside, so the dog waited in the corridor, whining softly at the door. Alec McLean sat at the metal table, shoulders hunched, eyes bloodshot. He looked less like a murderer and more like a man who had slept in his clothes, which he probably had. Blair prowled the room with the heavy gait of someone who liked the sound of his own steps. "You threatened him in public," Blair said, jabbing a thick finger toward Alec's chest. "You hate these incomers. You hate their money. You hate anything that reminds you you're a failure." Alec stared at the tabletop. "I was drunk," he muttered. "Folks say things when they're drunk." "And you slipped him a wee something in his whiskey, eh?" Blair leaned so close that Alec flinched. "A nice dose to send him off before the bells." "No," Alec snapped, lifting his head. His eyes flashed with something closer to fear than anger. "I'm not a poisoner. Ask anyone." The words felt heavy in the stale room. Anderson scribbled in his notebook, brow furrowed with unnecessary importance. "Subject hostile," he murmured as he wrote. Hamish watched Alec's hands, rough and chapped, twisting in his lap. Those were hands for mucking out sheds, not measuring poison. For a brief moment, Hamish felt a flicker of certainty that Alec was no careful killer. Then he remembered the villagers' cold looks, the slammed doors, the accusations that Hamish had abandoned them. He kept silent. Blair straightened, smug. "You were jealous," he said. "The Englishman comes in, waves money, makes promises. You drink your courage and decide to do something about it." Alec shook his head. "Crispin Vale was a fool, but I didn't kill him." "Save it," Blair said. "You're going nowhere." The interview ended badly, with Alec shouting that Blair was twisting his words. Anderson scurried after Blair with the transcript as if delivering treasure. Hamish followed at a slower pace, feeling as though he had left something important behind. Outside, in the car park, the drizzle had turned thick and unpleasant. Alec's sister waited under a dripping bus shelter. She came at Hamish the moment he stepped out. "He was with me at 5 to midnight, she said. Her voice trembled with anger. "We were arguing outside. I told him to stop embarrassing himself. He never left my sight till after the bells." Hamish believed her, not because the story was perfect, but because she looked ready to hit him if he didn't. Before he could ask where exactly they had stood, Blair burst through the station doors. "None of that." Blair waved a dismissive hand. "We're no collecting bedtime stories. He stays in the cell overnight." "He's innocent," she insisted. "Aye, I've never heard that one before." Blair marched past, shouting for Anderson to get Davitt on the phone. "Tell him the case is as good as sewn up." Hamish felt a tired ache settle in his chest. One wrong step on Hogmanay night, and Blair now had all the excuse he needed to pursue the easiest culprit. It was like watching a cart roll downhill, slow at first, then too fast to stop. Hamish drove back to Loch Dhu in the worsening drizzle. The wipers squeaked like a complaint. Lugs, finally allowed back in the car, curled unhappily on the seat, sensing the unease hanging over his master. When Hamish reached the village, cold needles of rain pricked his face. Everything and everyone looked sourer than usual. He headed toward the hotel because he was too tired to pick a better destination. The back entrance was open, a sure sign that the staff were rattled. A maid stepped out carrying a bin bag. She froze when she saw Hamish. "Sir," she said. Then lower, "I shouldn't talk to you. Mr. Blair says staff should keep out of things." Hamish forced a thin smile. "Blair says a lot. Most of it rubbish." Her eyes darted toward the hallway. "I saw something last night," she whispered. "Mr. Vale took a pill from a little silver tin just before the toast. Then someone called him away. The tin vanished after." Hamish stiffened. "What kind of pill?" "I don't know." She shook her head quickly. "He took them when he wanted to stay awake. That's what Lydia said once. Mr. Vale was always tired from everything." She swallowed. "Mr. Blair shouted at me this morning. Told me I was making things up. I'm not making things up." Hamish believed her. He also knew Blair would not listen. "Did you tell anyone else?" She shook her head. "Folk don't want trouble." "No," Hamish said. "They never do." The maid slipped back inside before he could ask anything more. Lugs let out a small, uneasy whine, as if he understood the girl's fear. Hamish stood under the overhang, rain dripping onto his collar, a silver tin of pills, Crispin taking something voluntarily, then disappearing with his glass, and the tin vanishing. Hamish tried to put the pieces into some shape, but they slid away from him. He felt a familiar irritation with his own mind. Other men would have theories already. He had only a muddle. When he turned to leave, Mrs. Carmichael appeared from nowhere, wrapped in a tartan shawl and glaring like a crow. "I hear Alec confessed," she said. "He did no such thing," Hamish replied. "Well, Blair says he did." "Blair says a lot of things," she sniffed. "Folk are saying you're protecting him, or protecting the hotel. Depends who you ask." Hamish did not bother answering. If Loch Dhu had decided he was to blame for something, it would cling to the idea like a burr. By late afternoon, Alec MacLean had officially become the man who killed the Englishman, if Strathbane was to be believed. Villagers whispered it in Patel's queue. Tourists repeated it in the hotel dining room. And Hamish, the village policeman who had failed to secure the scene, was blamed by both sides. He returned to the station with lugs pressing close to his leg. The peat fire smoked badly. Hamish sat down, staring at nothing. He had no clear suspect, no helpful villagers, no authority left with Blair, only a muddy streak in a corridor, a frightened maid, a vanished pill tin, and his own irritation with himself. Rain battered the windows again. Loch Dhu felt tighter, smaller, less forgiving than ever. Hamish rubbed his forehead. The case was already slipping from his control, and he could feel the next mistake waiting for him, like a stone in the road he'd trip over soon enough. Something was wrong with the weather again. It had turned to sleet overnight, the kind that splattered instead of falling, and Loch Dhu looked as though someone had smeared grey paint over the hills. Hamish Macbeth trudged along the loch road with lugs beside him, not because he fancied the walk, but because he had to get from one croft to the next, and the police Land Rover hated cold mornings even more than he did. The road to Alec MacLean's croft was lined with watchers. Neighbours stood in their doorways, arms folded, pretending they were only checking the roofs for leaks. Hamish ignored their stares, though he felt each one like a pebble thrown at his back. Alec's place looked worse than usual. The boundary fences leaned as if arguing with each other, and there were bits of coloured ribbon tied to posts to mark where one family said their land ended and another family said it didn't. Highland folk could hold grudges longer than they held livestock. Donnie McRae, an old crofter with a face like dried leather, waved from his doorway. "In wi' ye, Hamish," he called. "You're soaked through." Hamish hesitated. Donnie's house was a haven of gossip, and Hamish wasn't sure he wanted more of it. But sleet was sliding down his neck, and lugs had already trotted inside, so he followed. The kitchen smelled of damp peat and boiled tea. Donnie poured 2 mugs, both chipped. "Folk are saying Alec's finished," he said without preamble. "They say Blair'll make sure the court never hears another side." "Folk say too much," Hamish replied. "Aye, they do." Donnie reached for a drawer and rummaged through a pile of rubbish. String, rubber bands, a rusted tin opener. At last he pulled out a folded newspaper cutting, yellow with age. "But some things are worth saying." Hamish unfolded the clipping carefully. It showed Crispin Vale grinning beside half-built chalets. The headline promised prosperity. The text underneath listed unpaid builders, bankrupt crofters, and the abandoned resort that had remained a local eyesore for years. "Folk here read about it," Donnie said. "We kent what he was before he arrived." Hamish scanned the clipping again. Crispin had done more damage before even setting foot in Loch Dhu. "Why didn't anyone bring this up earlier?" he asked. Donnie gave a humourless snort. "Because nobody wanted to be first. If the man turned out fine, we'd look like jealous fools." Hamish thought that was exactly how Loch Dhu behaved, waiting for someone else to make the mistake first. He folded the clipping and tucked it into his pocket. When he stepped back outside, the watchers quickly pretended to be terribly busy inspecting washing lines or scraping mud off boots. Hamish ignored them and drove to Tommel Castle, sleet spitting at the windshield. The hotel manager met him in the corridor, hands clasped as though in prayer. "Constable, I do hope you're not here to cause more alarm. Our guests are already unsettled." Hamish said he wanted information, not alarm. The manager's mouth tightened, but he led Hamish to the office. Under pressure, and Hamish applied enough of it to crack the man's prissy calm, the manager admitted what no one had said directly. "Mr. Vale was negotiating to buy neighbouring crofts," he whispered, as if the furniture might repeat it. "For a holiday park. He wanted investors to see progress within the year." Hamish's eyebrows rose. "Crofts? Which ones?" "The usual ones folk fight over." The manager fussed with a pen. "Priscilla's father. He was dragged into it as a go-between. It put him in an awkward position. I'd thank you not to mention that." Hamish ignored the request. "And the old maps he carried?" The manager swallowed. "Related, I presume. But this hotel," he added primly, "has a reputation to maintain. We don't involve ourselves in messy disputes." Hamish wanted to say the hotel had already involved itself by letting Crispin Vale through its doors, but he held his tongue. The manager would only panic and tell Blair Hamish was stirring trouble. He left the hotel in worse temper than he'd arrived. Lugs trotted beside him, ears low, glancing up often. The dog didn't know details, but he recognised tension well enough. At the station, Hamish sat by the smoking peat fire and unfolded the clipping again. It felt weighty in his hand, though the paper was thin. A man who ruined one Highland village could ruin another. No wonder people had eyed Crispin the way they did. No wonder Alec, drunk and loud, had shouted threats without meaning them. Hamish should have taken the clipping straight to Blair, but Blair would twist it into proof that Alec had motive. Blair hated crofters almost as much as he hated Hamish. Instead, Hamish shoved the clipping into the bottom drawer of his desk, under old forms he had never bothered to file. It felt petty and cowardly, but he did it anyway. The telephone rang. Blair's voice barked down the line. "Any sign of more evidence, Macbeth?" "Nothing," Hamish said. "Just a mention of land deals in passing." "In passing?" Blair sounded triumphant. "So you're confirming motive." Hamish's stomach tightened. "I'm confirming idle talk," he said. "Folk complain about land every week." "You keep your nose out of it," Blair growled. "This case doesn't need your village sympathies." Hamish hung up, though Blair was still talking. The receiver clattered slightly. Lugs lifted his head, worried. Hamish leaned back and stared at the ceiling. He had just misled Blair, not for the first time, and likely not the last. But this time the lie felt closer to a mistake than a tactic. The land angle seemed too convenient, too familiar. A soured crofter, a greedy incomer, a bottle of poisoned whiskey. It sounded like a story the Highlands told itself when nothing else made sense. Yet Hamish allowed himself to believe it, not entirely. but enough to push aside the other pieces that bothered him. Harriet's pale face, the maid's whispered confession, the missing silver pill tin. He told himself they were not pressing. They could wait. Croft disputes, after all, were easier to understand than secrets inside a marriage or pills swallowed in the dark. Outside, the sleet turned briefly to a thin, icy rain. The hills disappeared behind a curtain of murk. Lochdu shrank to its cluster of lights and muddy roads. Hamish closed the drawer on the clipping with more force than needed. It rattled. Lugs flinched. Hamish rubbed the dog's ear in apology, though he still felt the weight of the folded paper as if it were pressing against him from inside the drawer. He had taken the easiest explanation. It sat uneasily in his mind, like a stone he didn't want to turn over. Somewhere beyond the murk, Blair was already telling Daviot the case was simple, and Hamish, by downplaying the truth, had helped make it seem that way. He poked the peat fire. It smoked more. Lugs coughed. Hamish stared into the dull embers. Something was wrong with the shape of this case, but he had chosen not to see it clearly, and now it would cost him. Something was already wrong at Tommel Castle before Hamish Macbeth even reached the steps. The snow, half melted and filthy, had turned the drive into a slushy mess that sucked at his boots. Lugs slipped twice, growling in irritation. Staff hurried about with shovels, pretending they had everything under control, which only meant they clearly didn't. Then Priscilla Halberton Smythe's car swept in, tyres hissing through the slush. Hamish felt his stomach clench. He had half hoped she would stay in London, far from the village muddle. Instead, she stepped out in a neat wool coat, composed as always, looking as though not even murder could ruffle her. "I thought I'd be more use here than at a London party," she said calmly. Hamish muttered something about the roads being bad. She didn't reply, only nodded to Lugs, who wagged his tail once before remembering he was supposed to be dignified. Inside the hotel lounge, the fire smoked and the air smelled of overcooked lunch. Priscilla sat in one of the deep chairs, hands folded. She listened without interrupting as Hamish explained what had happened since Hogmanay. The poison, Blair's theories, Alec's arrest. By the time he finished, he wished he'd spoken less. "So Blair has arrested Alec," she said. "And you think he's wrong?" Hamish shrugged, staring at a patch of worn carpet. "I'm not sure what I think." Priscilla's eyes narrowed slightly. "Crispin liked to push people's buttons. He bragged to father about cleaning up Lochdu. He may have had enemies beyond land." There was a quiet, sharp edge to her tone. Hamish remembered the maps under Crispin's arm and felt even more foolish for not paying them attention sooner. Before he could reply, the lounge door opened and a London couple swept in, dripping with self-importance. "This hotel," the woman declared loudly, "ought to offer us compensation for such disruption. Honestly, only in a place like this could the police be so provincial." Hamish pretended not to hear, though his ears burned. He felt suddenly shabby beside Priscilla's neat coat. Priscilla, however, turned to the woman with Arctic politeness. "You are in their village," she said, "not the other way round." The woman's mouth fell open. Her husband began studying the wallpaper with exaggerated interest. Hamish wished the floor would swallow him, though part of him felt a grim satisfaction at seeing the woman silenced. At dinner, Hamish sat alone at a side table. The London guests clustered together, talking in loud, careful tones, avoiding his gaze. Lugs lay under Hamish's chair, sighing dramatically each time someone complained about the cold or the food or Scotland in general. Priscilla eventually joined him, though she took the opposite chair as if keeping a polite distance. "You're not eating," she observed. "No hungry," he said, though he was. "Too much noise." "People try to fill silence when they're frightened," she said. "It's rarely helpful." Hamish took that as a rebuke, though she hadn't said it as one. He poked at his food and changed the subject. "Your father knew about the Croft plans." "He didn't like them," she replied. "Crispin tried to charm him. It didn't work." She glanced around the room, her expression tightening. People like him leave a trail behind them. Hamish felt a small twist in his chest. Envy or admiration, he couldn't tell, but he forced himself to nod as though he already knew everything she was saying. Later, the hotel bar filled with guests trying to escape the dinner's awkwardness. Voices rose, overlapping. Someone insisted Blair would soon arrest half the village. Someone else said the Highlands were dramatic, but in a tiresome way. Hamish stayed near the exit, hoping no one would try to speak to him. Priscilla appeared again, this time quieter, and leaned closer so no one could overhear. "I meant to tell you something," she said. "I saw Lydia slip out during the countdown on Hogmanay. She returned after the lights flickered. She looked flustered. She smoothed her dress as if someone had grabbed it. Hamish stiffened. Folk move about during parties. Not when they want to be seen, Priscilla replied. Her eyes held his in that cool, steady way that always made him doubt himself. He felt heat rising to his neck. Probably nothing, he said, waving a hand. Folk get bumped about. Priscilla's expression did not change, but he sensed her disappointment. He hated that more than he hated Blair's shouting. Luggs lifted his head at the raised voices from the bar. He looked up at Hamish with mournful eyes, as though asking why people insisted on making fools of themselves. Hamish scratched behind the dog's ear, though his mind was chewing on Priscilla's words. Lydia disappearing at the exact moment the lights failed, returning flustered, smoothing her dress. It was suspicious. He knew that. Yet he refused to seize on it too quickly. He didn't want Priscilla thinking he was jealous of Lydia or any woman. He didn't want her thinking anything at all, and so he said nothing. The evening dragged on. Guests gossiped loudly. Staff pretended not to listen. Hamish felt like an intruder in a place he'd known for years. With Priscilla near, he felt clumsy and slow-witted, as if every choice he made around her was the wrong one. When she finally stood to leave, she paused beside him. "You should look at all the pieces, Hamish," she said, "not just the comfortable ones." Her tone was gentle, but the words stung. He managed a stiff nod. She walked off, cool and controlled, leaving him with the sinking feeling that she saw more than he ever managed to. Hamish took Luggs outside. The air was sharp, mist drifting off the loch like breath. The snow had crusted over, turning the ground uneven. Luggs sniffed the path, unimpressed. Hamish stared toward the dark hills, feeling the familiar weight of uncertainty settle in his chest. Priscilla's return had brought clarity and confusion at once. She saw motives he'd ignored, angles he'd brushed aside, and secrets he wished were simpler. Worse, her presence made him hesitate, second-guess, and hide his instincts behind awkward shrugs. He stood there until Luggs nudged his leg, cold and wanting to go home. Hamish nodded to no one. He would have to decide soon whether Lydia's flustered moment meant something, or whether he was avoiding the truth because he didn't want to look foolish in front of Priscilla. The sleet began again, tapping softly against the hotel windows. Hamish felt the night tighten around him. Nothing was clearer. Everything was worse. And tomorrow, Blair would still be wrong. But Hamish still wouldn't know how to prove it. Something was wrong the moment Hamish stepped outside the station. A raw wind came tearing down from the hills, rattling the gutters as if determined to rip them off. It was the sort of wind that made people bad-tempered before breakfast. Luggs pressed against his leg, ears flat, already unhappy with the day. Hamish didn't blame him. He felt the same. Rumour said several villagers had done wee jobs for Crispin Vale, though no one cared to admit it once poison was mentioned. Hamish headed to the first croft on his list. Smoke curled weakly from the chimney. He knocked. The door opened 2 inches, just far enough for a single wary eye. "Aye," the man said, already sounding hostile. "I'm asking about work you might have done for Crispin Vale." "We've nothing to say." The door shut at once, the bolts sliding loudly. Luggs gave a small offended grunt. Hamish didn't bother knocking again. When folk used that tone, a second attempt never helped. At the next croft, a thin-faced woman answered, hands twisting in her apron. Crispin paid well, she insisted before he asked anything. Always prompt, never rude. Hamish doubted that last part. "What sort of work?" "Bits and pieces, lifting things, running something to the hotel." She kept staring at the apron as if it could offer guidance. He meant well. Folk in Lochdu rarely used the phrase "meant well" unless they hoped it absolved someone of being a nuisance. Hamish thanked her anyway. As he turned away, the woman muttered something he couldn't catch. It didn't matter. Her tone said enough. She wasn't lying entirely, but she wasn't telling him what she really knew either. A hail flurry struck as he made his way toward the loch. The path turned slick, half-frozen. Luggs trotted carefully, glancing back now and then to check Hamish wasn't about to fall on his face. Hamish muttered at the sky, which ignored him as usual. Near an outbuilding close to the water, he found Kenny Ross mending a battered boat. Kenny was a lanky youth with the expression of someone always expecting a scolding. He straightened when he saw Hamish. "I've done nothing wrong," Kenny said at once. "Folk are talking shite." Hamish crouched beside the boat. "I'm only asking about work you did for Crispin." Kenny hesitated, eyes darting left and right. "Aye, well, I did odd jobs. deliveries, private messages to Strathbane. He liked cash, didn't want his wife asking. This at least rang true. Crispin had seemed exactly the sort to hide things behind bundles of notes. Anything else? Kenny sighed, then reached under a tarp. He told me not to keep records, but I'm not daft. I kept a few, just in case he tried to cheat me. He handed over a dog-eared ledger, pages crinkled from damp. Pencil entries ran down the columns, names, amounts, dates. One line near the middle was scratched out so heavily the paper had torn slightly. Luggs leaned in and growled at the ledger, as though the smudged line itself smelled wrong. Hamish snapped, "Hoard your tongue," and the dog fell silent, offended. "Why's this name scratched out?" Hamish asked. Kenny looked miserable. "He told me to rub it out. Said it was private. Said he'd stop paying if I kept notes. I only wrote it once. I didn't see why he cared so much." Hamish rubbed the pad of his thumb over the torn section. Whatever name had been there was now a faint bruise of graphite. It nagged at him immediately. "You'll keep this to yourself," Kenny said nervously. "Folk'd think I'm spying." "Folk think everything," Hamish muttered. "But you did right keeping it." Before he could study the ledger further, his radio crackled. Blair's voice snarled through the static. "Macbeth, report. Any evidence from your end?" Hamish stared at the ledger, then at Kenny's anxious face. If he handed this over, Blair would haul half the village into Strathbane, which would cause more trouble than it solved. Villagers would see it as betrayal, and Blair would twist the scratched-out name into a proof of motive, even without knowing who it belonged to. "No," Hamish said curtly into the radio. "Nothing worth sending. Just proof Crispin spread money about." "Meaning he bribed people," Blair crowed. "Good, that fits." Hamish shut off the radio before Blair could say anything else. Kenny looked relieved but uneasy. "You're not going to tell Blair?" Hamish pocketed the ledger. "I'll deal with it." As he left the outbuilding, Luggs padded close, tail low, sensing the tension. Hamish didn't blame him. The wind cut across the loch like a knife, and the sky looked ready to spit hail again. Everything felt sharp and uncomfortable. On the path back to the village, Hamish forced himself to examine what he'd done. He'd lied to Strathbane deliberately this time, not by omission but directly, and he'd taken evidence without logging it. These were choices that could ruin him if Blair ever found out. But the thought of villagers being dragged across county lines, questioned for taking a tenner from an incomer, made his jaw tighten. At the square, Patel's shop door jingled with gossip. Mrs. Wellington announced loudly that Alec's guilt was obvious, though she hadn't seen him for days. A tourist muttered something about backward places, which Patel pretended not to hear. No one looked at Hamish except Luggs, who gave him a damp nudge. Hamish pushed through the chatter, ignoring the whispers that fell quiet whenever he passed. He went straight to the station. The fire had died down again, leaving a cold smell that clung to the air. He dropped into his chair and set the ledger on the desk. The scratched-out lines stared back at him. Whoever had paid Crispin, or been paid by him, had wanted their name hidden. But whether the motive had been greed, fear, or shame, Hamish couldn't tell. He felt the familiar irritation of not knowing something that everyone else would probably guess. Luggs nosed at his knee. Hamish rubbed the dog's head absently. The ledger felt like a trap he'd stepped in himself. "We'll see to it our way," Hamish said, though he wasn't sure Luggs, or anyone, should trust that promise. He shoved the ledger into a drawer beside the old newspaper cutting about Crispin's failed resort. 2 clues now, both hidden from Strathbane. 2 choices that boxed him further into a corner. Outside, the wind howled around the station walls, as if reminding him that mistakes in Loch Dhu never blew away. They only settled deeper. Hamish leaned back, staring at the dark window. He had protected the villagers again, and in doing so, he had weakened his own footing, possibly beyond repair. Nothing felt solved, everything felt narrower, and the scratched-out name waited in the drawer like a weight he could no longer ignore. Something was wrong with the fog. Even for Loch Dhu it was too thick, rolling down from the hills as if determined to smother every sound. Hamish Macbeth gripped the steering wheel of the police Land Rover, eyes narrowed at the faint suggestion of road ahead. He had just left Strathbane again, another pointless check-in, another round of Blair's jeers, and the fog felt like the last insult of the day. Luggs snored on the passenger seat, twitching now and then as if chasing something in his dreams. As the Land Rover crawled along the narrow stretch by the loch, Lugs jerked awake and gave a sharp bark. The sound shot straight through Hamish. Without thinking, he braked. Hard. The tyres skidded on the wet surface. At that same instant, a pair of headlights exploded out of the fog ahead. A dark car came roaring round the bend on the wrong side of the road, engine whining, speed far too high for the conditions. Hamish yanked the wheel toward the verge. Mud and stones burst upward, clattering against the chassis. For a moment he was certain the Land Rover would slide straight into the loch. His breath vanished. His hands locked around the wheel so tightly his knuckles shone white. But the tyres found grip. The vehicle jolted, shuddered, and came to an abrupt, ugly halt. The other car fishtailed past, missing him by inches, then vanished again into the fog as though swallowed whole. Hamish sat frozen. His heart thudded painfully in his chest. Lugs let out a low, furious growl, ears flat, hackles raised. "That was nae an accident," Hamish muttered. His voice sounded strange in the muffled air. Not in this weather. He waited a long moment before pulling the Land Rover back onto the road. His palms were damp, and the wheel felt slippery. Every instinct he had told him someone had meant to frighten him, or worse, and that someone had known he'd be driving that stretch at that time. That thought settled badly in his stomach. Back in Lochdu, lights glowed weakly behind curtains. The fog pressed against every window, turning the village into a collection of dim shapes. Hamish parked near the square. Lugs bounded out, still bristling. Hamish rubbed the dog's head. I didn't like it either. He went first to Patel's shop. A tourist was arguing over the price of batteries. Patel pretended to be calm, but shot Hamish a look suggesting he join the madhouse. Hamish ignored him, moving toward a local man he needed to speak with, Harriet Vale's visiting cousin, who happened to drive a dark car of similar make. The cousin straightened as Hamish approached, smile too smooth. "Constable, something wrong?" "Where were you this evening?" Hamish asked. "Here." The man gestured lazily around the shop. "All night. Ask anyone." His tone was light, but his eyes flickered slightly, betraying annoyance. Hamish glanced toward Patel, who was too busy dealing with his tourist to notice anything. "You've been here since sundown?" "Oh, absolutely," the cousin said, as if offended by the suggestion otherwise. It was too neat, too polished. People who told the truth rarely sounded so certain. Hamish thanked him and stepped back outside. The fog had thickened again, swirling around the lampposts. He made his way up the hill to the hotel, where Lydia's car was parked crookedly, half on the verge. When she spotted Hamish approaching, she waved cheerfully, far too cheerful for the circumstances. "Constable, don't tell me the fog's claimed another victim." "I'm asking about your car," Hamish said. "Was it out this evening?" She laughed, tossing her hair. "Barely made it up the hill earlier. You think I'd risk speeding anywhere? Goodness me, no." Her tone was bright, dismissive. Hamish disliked it immediately. Lydia was the sort who lied with a smile, believing charm was enough to distract a listener. Hamish had known too many like her. He nodded politely, though the answer satisfied him not at all. Inside the hotel, Blair was standing near the bar, inflating himself like a bullfrog. Anderson hovered behind him, clutching a notebook eagerly. The London guests lounged about, treating the murder as if it were a theatrical production staged for their stay. Blair pounced the moment he saw Hamish. "Macbeth, I hear you're spreading daft stories about someone trying to kill you on the road." Hamish kept his face blank. "A car came round the bend on the wrong side, nearly pushed me into the loch." Blair snorted. "Your driving's always been a menace. Maybe you scared yourself." "The fog was thick," Anderson chimed in, half gleeful. "Could have been anyone. Could have been you drifting." Hamish felt irritation prick at him. "The car sped up," he said. "Fish-tailed. It wasn't drifting." Blair waved a hand as if shooing a fly. "Maybe the killer's after you now," he said mockingly. "That'd make things easier for us." A few guests laughed nervously. Hamish felt the heat crawl up his neck. He hated giving Blair any satisfaction. "Someone kent I'd be on that road," Hamish said, low enough that only Blair heard. Blair raised his eyebrows. "Aye, maybe they did. Or maybe you're getting jumpy because you're hiding evidence." Anderson's head snapped up, eyes bright. Hamish forced his jaw to unclench. "I'm doing my job." "You're obstructing," Blair said. "I'll prove it soon enough." Hamish turned away before he said something worse. Lugs nudged his leg, sensing his distress. A few of the hotel staff watched from the doorway, whispering behind their hands. They looked at Hamish the same way the villagers did now, with uncertainty, suspicion, and a desperate hope that he wouldn't pull them into this any deeper. He left the hotel and stood outside under the dim porch light. Fog drifted across the drive, softening every edge. Hamish stared into it. Somewhere out there was the car that had nearly shoved him into the loch. Somewhere out there was someone panicked, or reckless, or both. He walked back toward the square, lugs trotting close. The fog made the world feel smaller, each step swallowed quickly behind him. He replayed the moment on the road in his mind. The sudden headlights, the roar of the engine, the deliberate wrong side. He couldn't shake the feeling that it had been timed. Someone had known he was returning from Strathbane. Someone had known he'd take the loch road. Someone had counted on the fog. The village lights looked ghostly when they finally appeared again. Hamish paused outside the station door, lugs pressing against his leg. The case had become something uglier than land disputes and village grudges. Someone was watching him now. Someone who feared what he might uncover, or feared what he already knew. Inside, the station felt colder than before. Hamish closed the door gently, as if noise might make things worse. Lugs curled up at his feet. Hamish sat, staring at the fog pressing against the window. Nothing felt accidental anymore. Something was wrong as soon as Hamish reached the hotel corridor. The air felt too still, too heavy, as if the walls themselves were waiting for bad news. The door to Crispin Vale's suite stood half open. Inside, Harriet Vale was packing with sharp, efficient movements that looked more like punishment than tidying. 2 suitcases lay open on the bed, clothes folded without care. She didn't turn when Hamish stepped in. "They'll have you thinking I did it next," she said, her voice flat. "You may as well get ahead of it." Hamish stood awkwardly near the door. Lugs sniffed at a discarded scarf, then backed away, sensing tension. "I only came to see if you needed help," Hamish said. It sounded weak even to him. Harriet gave a small, bitter laugh. "Help? The only help anyone here can give is keeping their mouths shut, and that won't happen." Hamish had no reply. Harriet's eyes were rimmed red, though she held herself upright in the cool, stiff way of someone refusing to fall apart where others might see. She shoved another shirt into the suitcase. "Crispin was planning to leave television," she said abruptly. "Pack it in and move here full time. God help me." "You didn't want that?" Hamish asked. "No." Her hand stilled for the first time. He was bored with everything, except trouble. Trouble woke him up. She closed the suitcase with more force than necessary. If he'd settled here permanently, he'd have bored himself into inventing new disasters. Hamish wondered what sort of marriage required a person to brace themselves for their spouse's presence, but he didn't ask. Asking would have made it real, and Harriet didn't look ready for real things. As she reached for a pair of shoes, Hamish spotted something on the bedside table. A small silver pill tin, gleaming faintly. It looked too casually placed for something Lydia had sworn had vanished. Unless it hadn't vanished at all, unless Harriet had picked it up after the commotion and brought it back here. Hamish's stomach tightened, the same kind the maid had described. His stomach tightened. Before he could speak, Harriet's gaze followed his. She flushed and snatched the tin up, hiding it fast in her fist. "Please," she said, her voice suddenly low. "Don't give them any more to talk about." Hamish stepped closer. "Were those his pills?" "They weren't prescribed properly," she murmured. "He took them when shoots ran late, or when he wanted to stay awake for parties. They kept him going, sometimes too much. If Blair hears the word drugs—" She broke off, jaw tightening. "He'll drag my name through every paper from here to London." Hamish felt that small, dry tug of pity he hated, the kind that made him agree to things without thinking. He shouldn't feel pity for suspects or widows who kept secrets. But Harriet looked cornered, and he didn't like seeing anyone cornered. "Let me see the tin," he said quietly. She hesitated, then handed it over. Her fingers trembled despite her attempt to appear composed. Hamish held the tin in his palm. It felt too light, too innocent. He opened it. 3 pills lay inside, dull white, unmarked. "Please," Harriet whispered. "If Blair finds these, he'll invent a scandal. He'll enjoy it." Hamish almost said that police work wasn't about enjoyment, but with Blair it often was. The thought of Blair waving the tin around at reporters made Hamish's stomach twist. He closed the lid and slipped the tin into his pocket. "No one needs to see it." Harriet let out a slow breath, though she didn't thank him. Gratitude sat awkwardly on her. Instead, she resumed folding clothes, as if the moment hadn't happened. Lugs watched Hamish with cautious eyes. Dogs knew when their masters were doing something foolish. Hamish cleared his throat. "Did Crispin say anything before midnight?" "Only that the Highlands might finally wake him up," she said. "He said it as if the place were asleep and needed him to shake it." She shook her head. "He annoyed everyone, but annoyance isn't murder." Hamish wasn't so sure. Annoyance turned into fury quickly in small places, and Crispin had a talent for stirring it up. A knock sounded at the open door. Blair shoved his head in, looking like a bulldog delighted to find intruders. "Macbeth, Daviot wants an update. Any sign of funny substances among the man's belongings?" Hamish felt the tin like a hot coal in his pocket. "No," he said flatly. "Nothing." Blair grunted. "Figures. You Highlanders hide everything, even from yourselves." He gave Harriet a long, unpleasant stare, then withdrew, heavy footsteps thudding down the corridor. Harriet looked at Hamish. For a second he thought she might say something softer. Instead, she returned to her packing with cold precision. Hamish couldn't blame her. He wasn't sure he would trust himself either. Harriet's voice followed him to the door, flat and exhausted. "I'll go to the Kirk Hall later," she said, "only to keep up appearances. Then I'm leaving by evening, if the village doesn't tear me to pieces first." He left the room. Lugs padded beside him, pausing to sniff at Blair's fading scent with disgust. Hamish rubbed the dog's head. "Dinna look at me like that," he muttered. "It's done now." Outside, the air was wet and miserable, drizzle drifting sideways. The hills loomed in colourless shapes. The hotel flags slapped weakly in the wind. A few tourists hurried past Hamish as though afraid he might arrest them for being inconvenient. Hamish walked down the steps, feeling the weight of the tiny silver tin against his leg. He had protected Harriet. He had shielded her from Blair, but he had also weakened his own case, and he knew it. The pills might have explained Crispin's collapse. They might have been swapped or tampered with. They might have led to a motive or at least a path not yet taken. But Hamish had acted instinctively, as he often did, choosing human discomfort over strict procedure. Now the investigation was poorer for it, and Blair would sense something was missing long before Hamish could cover the gap. He reached the Land Rover, opened the door and sat heavily. Lugs jumped in, curling immediately at his feet. Hamish didn't start the engine. He stared through the windshield at the blurred shapes of the village. Lochdu had never felt so small, so tight around him. Every choice he made seemed to narrow the path ahead. He reached into his pocket, touched the tin, then let it fall back. He would hide it for now, maybe forever, maybe until he understood what Crispin had been doing with those pills, and who might have known. Lugs lifted his head and gave a soft, uncertain whine. "Aye," Hamish said, "I know." He started the engine. The drizzle smeared the windows. He drove slowly toward the station, the weight of the lie pressing as steadily as the Highland rain. Nothing he'd done today felt right, and he suspected tomorrow would be worse. Something was wrong with the Kirk Hall the moment Hamish Macbeth stepped inside. The place looked stripped bare, as if Hogmanay had been dragged out by the scruff of its neck and thrown into the snow. The decorations were gone, leaving bits of tape on the walls. A trestle table sagged under the weight of sandwiches and scones that already looked tired. The smell of weak tea drifted through the room, mixed unpleasantly with peat smoke from damp coats hung too close to the radiator. Priscilla had suggested the remembrance tea, saying it might soothe tempers and show the hotel's goodwill. Hamish doubted it. Nothing soothed tempers in Lochdu except gossip that made someone else look worse. Still, the villagers came, drawn by habit and free food. Lugs wove between chairs, vacuuming crumbs and bumping ankles. Hamish tried to stay near the back, but people insisted on stopping him. Some offered forced sympathy, as if Crispin's death were his personal responsibility. Others whispered questions they pretended were casual. He answered as little as possible. Every word felt like an invitation to trouble. The chatter was low and stiff until Mrs. Wellington rose from her chair with the determined look of a woman preparing to ruin an entire afternoon. Her cheeks were flushed, her hat crooked from the heat. "I will say it," she announced, voice carrying across the hall. "It's not Alec we should be looking at. It's that wife. She wanted rid of him, you could tell." Gasps went up. Conversations froze like startled deer. Harriet Vale, seated stiffly near the tea urn, went white. Her hand jerked, sloshing tea onto the table. The minister made a strangled noise, half rising. "How dare you," Harriet said, her voice trembling. "You don't know anything." "Oh, I?" Mrs. Wellington sniffed. "A wife knows her husband's faults best, and he had plenty. Folk saw how you looked at him." "That's enough," Hamish said sharply, but no one heard him, or pretended not to. The room devolved quickly. Half the women tried to hush Mrs. Wellington, the other half leaned forward as if attending a play. One of the hotel maids, there to represent the staff, wrung her apron and then blurted out, "Well, she was at the bar with him right before the lights went. She kept fussing, saying she'd better pour it herself so he wouldn't overdo it. Said it was to keep him from drinking too much." Harriet spun toward the maid. "Because he was drinking too much. He always did." But the maid avoided her eyes, staring instead at Hamish with the guilt of someone who'd said far too much. Lugs growled softly under a table, uneasy with the rising pitch of voices. Someone near the sandwiches piped up. "Lydia was in the pantry when the lights flickered. I saw her. She told us she was in the hall." "That's a lie," Lydia snapped from the doorway, though she hadn't been accused directly. Her eyes darted around the room. "I went for napkins. It's hardly suspicious." "It is, when you keep changing your story," muttered Mrs. McLean, arms folded tightly. More gasps. Even the teapot seemed to hiss louder. Hamish tried again. "Folks, this is not the place." But Mrs. Carmichael cut across him, eager to contribute. "And what about the clock outside the library?" Mrs. Carmichael said triumphantly. "Folk are saying it stopped at the bells, then others say it was still going after. I heard someone swear it was a few minutes past 12. Hamish felt his stomach drop. That detail hadn't been shared widely, only hinted at. And now it bounced from mouth to mouth like a pebble flung through glass. A man near the back shook his head. "So folk were lying about timings. That means someone's covering something." More voices rose at once, overlapping accusations, half-truths, and muttered defences. The noise thickened into something ugly. Blair, who had slunk in late, leaned against the far wall with an expression of pure satisfaction, as if this chaos proved every low opinion he held of Highlanders. Anderson stood beside him, notebook poised gleefully, waiting for someone to say something incriminating. Harriet finally broke. She turned on Hamish, eyes bright and furious. "You told me you'd keep an eye on him," she said. "You did nothing." Her voice cracked. The hall went silent again, the kind of silence that amplified humiliation instead of soothing it. Hamish's face burned. He hadn't promised her anything. Not exactly, but he might as well have. The accusation hit harder than he expected. It wasn't murder she blamed him for. It was failure, and failure he couldn't argue with. "I did what I could," he said, though the words felt small. "No," Harriet whispered. "You didn't." Priscilla stepped forward then, attempting to steer the conversation away from Harriet's collapse. "This tea was meant to calm matters," she said evenly. "Perhaps we should—" But Mrs. Wellington interrupted. "Calm? When a killer's walking about? We've every right to talk." The minister raised his hands in futile appeal. "Please, this is a remembrance, not a trial." "That's exactly what it is," Mrs. McLean snapped. "Folk are sick of being polite when there's a murderer in our midst." The temperature in the room dropped. Even Lugs crawled under a bench, ears flattened, unwilling to be seen at all. Hamish glanced at Blair, who smirked as if enjoying the spectacle of Lochdu tearing itself apart. Hamish wanted to throttle him, or anyone really, just to silence the noise. Instead, he stepped into the centre of the hall. "That's enough," he said. "This helps no one." But only a few people quieted. Most kept muttering about pantry doors, whiskey glasses, and clocks. They tossed details around like stones, not caring whom they hit. It was then Hamish noticed something. Harriet wasn't just embarrassed. She was shrinking into herself, shoulders folding inward, eyes darting like a trapped animal. Whatever secrets she kept, whatever sharpness she'd shown earlier, she couldn't withstand this room. When she stood abruptly, knocking her chair backward, the hall startled again. She pushed past Hamish without looking at him, rushing toward the exit. Lugs scrambled after her, confused but loyal. Hamish followed, though slower. Outside, the snow had begun again in soft, miserable flurries. Harriet stood by the kirk wall, breathing hard. Hamish approached cautiously. "You shouldn't have listened to them," he said. "They're your people," she said hollowly, "and they think I killed my husband." Hamish didn't answer. She wasn't wrong. A distant shout echoed from inside as another argument flared. Harriet flinched. "I need to leave this village," she said, "before they finish tearing me apart." Hamish wished he had something better to offer than silence, but silence was all he had. He walked her back toward the road, stopping only when she gestured that she preferred to be alone. When Hamish returned to the Kirk Hall, voices were still raised. Blair hovered like a crow, delighted. Lydia had cornered Priscilla. The minister wrung his hands. Sandwiches lay abandoned, curling at the edges. The remembrance tea had done nothing but peel back every layer of pretense. The toast timing, the pantry visit, the stopped clock. They were now floating clues with no shape, magnified by anger into something darker. Hamish stood in the doorway, feeling the hall tilt slightly around him. Lochdu had begun to devour its own, and he had no idea how to stop it. Hamish knew the day was tightening again the moment he stepped out of the station. The air over Lochdu felt heavy, as if the sky itself were holding its breath before dropping more sleet. Lugs trotted at his heel, uneasy. A passing crofter muttered, "They're heading for the hotel," and would not meet Hamish's eyes. That alone was enough to set his stomach tightening. By the time he reached Tommel Castle, Blair's police car sat crookedly at the entrance, lights flashing as if he had caught a murderer in the act. Anderson hovered beside him, notebook already out, though he had nothing yet to write. Guests gathered in clumps, pretending to complain to each other while greedily watching for spectacle. Blair always did bring out the worst. Inside the lobby, Harriet Vale stood very straight, her coat folded over one arm. She looked as if she had been waiting for bad news and was annoyed to see it arrive on schedule. Blair pushed through the doors and announced far louder than needed, "Harriet Vale, you are under arrest for the murder of your husband." His voice echoed around the plastered walls. Someone gasped in delight. Hamish stepped forward. "You cannae do that, Blair. There's nothing linking her to poison." Blair gave him a look of long enjoyment. Opportunity. Motive. And that tearful display yesterday, blaming the village, that's guilt. Anderson scribbled fast, nodding like a dog begging for praise. "That's nonsense," Hamish snapped. "Alec has an alibi. Lydia's stories didn't match. The timing." "You're too close to these folk," Blair said. "Always have been. Step aside." His tone held the smugness of a man performing for an audience, and the guests, sensing drama, leaned in eagerly, their English vowels bright against the dull hum of local voices. From the staircase, Priscilla watched in her cool way. "Inspector," she said sharply, "you're making a performance of a tragedy." Her voice froze several tourists mid-whisper. Blair hated being scolded by anyone well-dressed, and she was elegance itself. Harriet lifted her chin. "I trusted the wrong people," she said, barely above a whisper. It was unclear whether she meant the villagers, her husband, or Hamish himself. She went with the officers without protest, her back very straight, refusing to give Blair the satisfaction of seeing fear. Hamish followed them to Strathbane, mostly because he could not bear not to. In the corridor outside the interview room, Harriet stopped and asked, "A moment, Constable Macbeth." Blair rolled his eyes but allowed it, perhaps hoping it would produce something he could twist. She led Hamish to a side alcove. "On the night of the party," she said quietly, "I heard Lydia arguing in one of the service corridors. She wasn't alone, a man's voice, angry, and I heard the words blackmail and ruined. I didn't see them. I didn't care then. Now they'll use everything against me." Hamish felt the old awkwardness rise in him. "Why didn't you say earlier?" "Would it have mattered? You lost control of that room the moment he died." Her tone wasn't cruel, it was worn out. "I know Crispin made enemies, but I'm not the sort who mixes poison into drinks." Blair stormed back down the corridor. "Interview time," he barked. Harriet walked past him with tight dignity, not looking at Hamish again. Inside the glass-walled room, Hamish stood at the back while Blair circled Harriet like a terrier snapping at a butcher's apron. "You poured his drink," Blair said, leaning in so close she had to pull back slightly. "Witnesses put you right there." "I kept him from drinking too much," Harriet replied. "Anyone married to a man like Crispin would understand." "Oh, aye," Blair sneered. "Poor you, victim of the big bad star." Anderson's pencil scratched. "You had control of him, and when he said he'd move here full-time, maybe you snapped." "I didn't want him moving here," Harriet said bluntly. "That's hardly proof I killed him." Hamish watched her hands. They were steady, folded neatly on the table. There was something grimly admirable in her calm, but he remembered the pill tin burning a weight in his pocket and the lie he'd told Blair. One more fault, one more obstacle between him and the truth. Finally, Blair ended the session, convinced he had broken the case open. Harriet was taken to a holding cell upstairs. Hamish remained in the corridor for a moment, listening to the faint slam of the door. Lugs whined softly, as if aware that something had gone wrong beyond repair. Back in Lochdu, the story broke before Hamish could say a word. Mrs. Wellington told Patel that Harriet near confessed in the Kirk Hall. Old Donny McRae claimed he had always suspected TV folk. And Mrs. McLean, Alec's sister, said coldly, "They'd sooner arrest a widow than admit they blamed my brother without cause." She shut her door in Hamish's face. Priscilla found him outside the hotel later. The wind whipped her hair across her cheek. "So Blair has his culprit," she said. "Convenient for him, horrible for her." Hamish scuffed the ground. "She told me something. Lydia was arguing with a man that night. She heard the word blackmail." Priscilla's expression didn't change, but her voice did. "Then why isn't Blair chasing that?" She already knew the answer. "Because it doesn't fit his tidy version," Hamish muttered. She looked at him for a long moment, then said quietly, "Hamish, you'll have to fix this. No one else here will." It wasn't encouragement. It was fact. That was worse. When she left, the night felt heavier than before. Fog crept low along the loch, softening the village lights as if the place was shrinking into itself. Lugs pressed against his leg, uneasy. Hamish stood there, realizing that Blair's wrong collar, Harriet, was not only a mistake but a trap. If he let it stand, the truth would be buried. If he fought it, his own lies, especially about the tin, would rise first. He walked back to the station with the fog curling behind him, feeling the case twist in a direction he had never wanted. No triumph, no clarity, only the dull sense that every step he'd taken since Hogmanay had been the wrong one, and the next would likely be worse. Sleet rattled against the police station windows so hard it sounded like someone throwing handfuls of gravel. Hamish stood at the desk, staring at Blair's typed order instructing him to stay off all further investigatory activity. The wording was pompous enough to make his teeth itch. Luggs sat by the door, tail thumping once, then stopping when he sensed Hamish's mood. Outside, the sky sagged low and grey over Lochdu, the kind of wet cold that soaked into bone. Being told to keep out of things only made the morning feel worse. He pulled on his jacket anyway. Orders were one thing, common sense was another. Something had been tugging at him since the night of the party. Not a theory, he didn't bother with those, but a plain, nagging sense of something overlooked. "Come on then," he muttered to Luggs. "We'll not be missed." Luggs barked once in agreement. The path along the loch near Tommel Castle was churned with mud, sleet falling in sheets that blurred the water into a single dull smear. Hamish kept his head down. He wasn't reflecting or brooding. He was simply walking where the road took him, boots squelching as Luggs darted ahead. Near the old boathouse, he stopped. The ground looked wrong. A mess of trampled mud, yes, but underneath it were shapes that didn't match the usual boots of crofters or hotel staff. He crouched, brushing away grit. One faint outline showed a narrower heel, almost delicate, overlapping with deeper prints heading toward the water and back again. Impossible to say when they were made, but they were not the prints of a man stumbling drunk at midnight. He rubbed his nose, unimpressed with the weather and everything else. "Folk wandering about where they shouldn't," he muttered. Luggs whined as if in agreement. Inside the boathouse, the stale smell of damp rope and old varnish hung thick. Hamish nudged aside a coil of rope with his boot. Something plastic crinkled faintly. He bent and pulled out a small bag tucked behind a crate. Inside was a whiskey bottle, the same brand used for the Hogmanay toast. This one was half full, the seal broken, the label smudged with a brownish smear. He uncapped it, sniffed, and jerked back. There was a sharp medicinal tang beneath the whiskey fumes. "Well, that's not right," he said. It wasn't shock or revelation, just the plain, stubborn fact that someone had prepared more than one bottle. He tucked it back into the bag. Blair would likely laugh in his face, saying Hamish planted it himself. Better to keep it for now. Facts didn't need applause, they only needed time. Back at the hotel, sleet dripping from his hair, Hamish found the caretaker wrestling with a clogged drain. "While you're there," Hamish said, trying for casual, "the fuse box. Mind showing me something?" The caretaker eyed him warily. "I'm not getting dragged into Blair's business." Hamish shrugged. I'm off the case, just curious. That reassured the man enough to lead him down a narrow corridor. The fuse box was old, the sort that crackled when touched. One switch was labelled Fairy Lights Hall, separate from the rest. She had me rig it this way, the caretaker muttered. Lydia said she wanted a dramatic moment for the toast, practically shoved me aside to get it right. So someone could trip just these lights, Hamish said, and keep the rest on? Aye, easy, the caretaker frowned. Flick of a finger. But dinna tell Blair I told you. Hamish left him grumbling. The sleet had turned heavier, clinging to his coat in wet patches. Priscilla appeared near the lounge, a file under her arm. Her expression was unreadable. Father mentioned something odd this morning, she said, as if commenting on the weather. Before Hogmanay, he received an anonymous note. It said, "What happened in Glenfinnan will happen here if you let him buy the land." Hamish's eyebrows lifted. Where's the note? Priscilla gave a thin smile. That's the trouble. It's gone. Father claims he misplaced it. Mother swears she never saw it. Lydia hovered around them rather a lot that week. He grunted. Folk misplace things only when someone else wants them gone. He didn't comment further. Priscilla always preferred to leave implications lying between them like cold stones. She studied him briefly. You're still working, even after Blair's order. Walking, Hamish corrected. Folk do that. You found something, she said, not asking. He didn't answer. She gave a small nod, accepting his silence as expected. Try not to get yourself suspended, she murmured, turning away. In the sleet again, heading toward the station, Hamish felt the pieces nudging at him. Not forming a picture, just nudging. A hidden bottle with a medicinal smell, lights tripped on command, footprints outside a boathouse, a vanished warning note. Crispin's past in Glenfinnan stirring enough bitterness for someone to write threats. None of it matched Harriet's quiet misery, nor Blair's neat suspicions. Near the post office, old Mrs. Carmichael waved him over. "Constable," she said loudly, "you'll want to know folk are saying Harriet's been seen crying into her teapot." Her eyes shone with relish. "A guilty conscience, I'd say." Hamish sighed. "Folk say too much." "And you say too little," she retorted. "If you ken something, you'd best act before Blair botches it further." She stepped back into the warmth of the shop, leaving him wet and irritated. By the time he reached the station, Luggs was plastered with mud and shaking miserably. Hamish rubbed him with a towel, muttering, "Aye, I ken. We're in it now." He placed the bagged bottle in the bottom drawer of his desk beside the newspaper cutting, the ledger notes, and other scraps that Strathbane didn't deserve to touch. He didn't tell Blair. He didn't tell Priscilla. He didn't tell Harriet sitting in her cell. He didn't tell anyone, not yet. But he could still make people stand in the same place again, and sometimes that was all the truth needed. The sleet rattled on the roof with grim persistence. Hamish stared at the drawer for a long moment. He felt no triumph, no cleverness, just the stubborn knowledge that the official arrest didn't fit the world as it was. The physical facts, even half-washed footprints, were refusing to lie for Blair. Hamish pulled on his coat again. "Orders or no orders," he said to Luggs, "we keep going." Luggs barked once, sharp and hopeful, as if he had been waiting for the words. Outside, the sleet blurred the lights of Loch Dhu until the village looked like a smear of wavering shadows. Hamish walked toward them anyway, knowing the next wrong turn waited somewhere ahead. Hamish knew something was wrong the moment he stepped into Tommel Castle's main hall. The place felt too clean, as if the staff had been told to scrub away every trace of Hogmanay except the faint cling of stale whiskey. Even the air seemed nervous. Anderson hovered by the doorway, arms folded, pretending to supervise but looking more like a schoolboy told to stay put. Luggs padded in behind Hamish, sniffed at a hearthrug, then settled with his chin on his paws, brown eyes alert. "Let's get on with it," Hamish said. "This is not an official anything, just a run-through for the insurance forms." Lydia, standing near the bar in a tight black dress, gave a brittle laugh. "You're wasting time. Nothing will change." "We'll see," Hamish replied. He motioned people to their places. Priscilla stood near the tall windows, composed and silent. Kenny Ross lurked by the wall, cap in hand, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. The hotel manager fussed about the glassware, muttering about reputations. A few villagers who had been near the bar that night shifted uneasily, regretting ever agreeing to help. Hamish ignored their discomfort. "Just stand where you were at the bells. Close enough is fine." They moved with the air of people humouring a child. Hamish counted their shuffling feet, noting who chose distance from whom. Then he nodded to the caretaker, a dour man who had spent half the morning complaining about the wiring. "You've got the lights ready?" "Aye," the man grunted. "Same as Hogmanay." Hamish went behind the bar. He took out 2 bottles of whiskey, placing them side by side. One came from the hotel's stockroom. The other he had kept bagged and hidden since the boathouse. Seal broken, label smudged, the faint medicinal tang still clinging to it. He did not pour it. He only set it where everyone could see it, like a quiet accusation. "Hold your glasses as you did at the Bells," he said instead, pushing 2 empty tumblers across the bar, one to Lydia, one to the manager. "Just to see the angle you were holding your drinks," he said. They both frowned at him, but took the glasses. Hamish carried on in a bored voice. "We'll count down from 10, aye, same as that night." Anderson opened his mouth. "We don't need theatrics." "Hush," Hamish said. "You're here to observe." That shut him up. Hamish raised his hand. 10, 9, 8. As he counted, he saw Lydia watching the glass she held as though it were a snake. The manager looked annoyed, then distracted when one of the villagers whispered something to him. Luggs lifted his head sharply at 4, ears pricking. 3, 2, 1. The caretaker flicked the switch. The fairy lights died at once, leaving only the fire glow. Someone gasped. A small, involuntary sound. Hamish heard a faint scrape like a shoe sliding on polished wood. Then the caretaker switched the lights back on. Lydia's face had gone white. She was clutching her glass so tightly her knuckles stood out, though she had barely taken a sip. Hamish watched her. She didn't look frightened. She looked caught. "What is this?" she snapped. "Just a wee test," Hamish said. "One of those bottles was doctored before Hogmanay. The doctored one was hidden in the boathouse. You know which one not to drink." A ripple went through the room. The manager muttered, "This is ridiculous," but he set his glass down quickly. Priscilla said nothing, only watched Lydia with a level, cold expression that made the woman twitch. Lydia tried to laugh. "You can't prove anything." "I don't need to," Hamish replied. "You've already done that. You're the only one who reacted when the lights went out. You were the only one who refused to touch your drink properly. You knew one bottle wasn't safe." "That doesn't mean—" "And you arranged the fairy lights," Hamish added quietly. "Told the caretaker to put them on a separate line for a nice effect. You wanted darkness at a specific moment." Kenny shifted on his feet. His cap nearly slipped from his hands. "I only helped with the switches," he blurted. "She paid me for it. Said it was for drama." Lydia rounded on him, eyes bright with fury. "You little fool!" "That's enough," Hamish said. "Let him speak." Kenny swallowed hard. "She had me take a bottle down to the boathouse earlier that day. Told me not to mention it. Said it was for a private toast. I didn't ken it was anything bad." "So," Hamish said, 2 bottles, one for the party, one for what you wanted to happen." Lydia's voice rose. "He was destroying people. Do you know what he did in Glenfinnan? Do you know how many families he ruined? He was going to do it here, and someone I care about, was going to pay for it again. I wasn't going to let that happen." "And the blackmail?" Hamish asked. Her mouth snapped shut. A muscle jumped in her jaw. "Harriet heard you arguing," Hamish said, "about someone being ruined." "She didn't understand," Lydia said, defeated now. "Crispin found out about the past. He was going to use it. He liked using people. He liked watching them squirm. I thought, if he were ill, just a little, if he cancelled the deal, everything would settle. But he kept drinking. He took more than he should have. It wasn't meant to kill him." No one spoke. Even Anderson looked shaken. Hamish said, "You dosed the second bottle yourself?" "Yes," she whispered. "Only enough to upset him. That's all." Kenny looked sick. "You said it was nothing." Lydia turned away from him. Hamish let out a small breath. "This is not an official confession. Blair will want to shout at everyone first. But the truth's clear enough." Lydia's shoulders sagged. "Do what you want, then." Hamish didn't answer. He simply stepped back. The villagers shifted, unsure whether to gloat or pity her. Priscilla moved first, walking toward the door with a cool, distant grace that made Lydia shrink a little. Hamish followed her. Outside the hall, she stopped. "You handled that well," she said. Hamish shook his head. "Blair will take credit anyway." "He usually does." Hamish glanced back toward the hall. "It's not over. There's more lying under all this." Priscilla's expression didn't change. "Then you'll deal with it." Hamish didn't reply. He stepped into the cold air with lugs trotting beside him, uneasy as ever. The snow had begun again, tiny sharp flakes swirling in the dark. Somewhere behind him, raised voices echoed faintly from the hall. Something still didn't fit, but he couldn't name it yet. Not in words, not even to himself. Blair came back to Lochdu in a temper that shook the station door on its hinges. Hamish heard the slam from the yard and felt the old, dull sense of trouble settling over him. Lugg stopped lapping from his bowl and slunk behind Hamish's legs as Blair stormed in, coat dripping sleet everywhere. "You've overstepped yourself for the last time, Macbeth," Blair roared, jabbing a finger so close that Hamish had to lean back. "You ruin a perfectly sound case with your village theatrics, and now the whole thing's a circus." Hamish kept his voice level. Lydia confessed. "To you," Blair shouted. "Not to me, not on camera, not in a proper interview room. You let her blather in front of half the villagers and expect that to stand up." Daviot appeared behind him like a pale ghost attempting diplomacy. He smiled a thin smile that fooled no one. "We'll manage the optics, Hamish." Inspector Blair was engaged in a vigorous pursuit, and officially that is the narrative we will follow. "So I'm the footnote again," Hamish said. "Don't be dramatic," Daviot murmured, brushing imaginary dust off his sleeve. "You should have shared your suspicions earlier. We can't have lone wolf behaviour." Hamish bit back the obvious retort. "You ordered me off the case. It never helped to state the truth in Strathbane." Blair made a sound like a bull clearing its throat. "Where is she?" "In the holding room," Hamish said. "Anderson drove her straight here after she spoke in the hall. She's calm enough now, but she wants a solicitor." Blair lumbered away, muttering about women who think they're clever and villages full of idiots. Daviot followed, already shaping his official version of events. Hamish went to the holding room. Lydia sat on the edge of the metal chair, fingers twisting in her lap. Her eyes were raw, the bravado gone. "It wasn't murder," she said flatly. "Not how they'll paint it." "I know," Hamish said, "but they'll want everything." She told it again, the way truly guilty people rarely do. No drama, no performance, just dull, exhausted facts. She had been part of Crispin's Glenfinnan project years ago. She'd believed him then, repeated his promises, vouched for him. Then the project collapsed, the money vanished, and friends of hers lost their savings. One man, she whispered, had taken his own life. Crispin blamed market forces. Lydia blamed herself. When Crispin came north again with his new schemes, he dangled that old secret over her, threatening to expose her part in Glenfinnan to keep her compliant. And she was compliant, too useful, too frightened, too bound up in the lies she had helped spread. "I thought if he were shaken up," she said, staring at the floor, "he might stop, a scare, nothing more." "The doctored whiskey," Hamish said. She nodded. "Just enough to make him dizzy, that's all. But with the pills he took, God knows how many, and his heart." She trailed off. Hamish didn't soften. People wanted comfort at moments like this, but he had none to give. "You brought Kenny into it." "He didn't know," she whispered. "Not really. He thought it was some silly drama for the party. Crispin liked theatrics." Hamish knew that was true. It didn't help. When Blair barged in for his official interview, Lydia's face went blank, the protective shell snapping back into place. Blair crowed and barked and strutted through the questions, doing everything short of setting off fireworks to mark his victory. Lydia answered in cold, clipped sentences. Hamish stayed in the corner, silent. His presence only made Blair louder. Later that afternoon, Harriet Vale was released. She stepped out of Blair's office looking 10 years older. Her coat hung limply, and her hair was pinned with the stiff precision of someone determined not to break. "Mrs. Vale," Hamish said awkwardly. She stopped. Her eyes were clear, too clear. "You believed the worst of me quickly enough." "I believed the simplest story," Hamish said. "That's the same thing," she replied. "You chose what to see and who to believe. You were wrong." He took the rebuke without protest. She wasn't shouting. That made it worse. "Thank you for clearing my name," she added stiffly. Then she left the station, back straight, never looking back. Her eyes flicked once, briefly, to the drawers behind the desk, as if she remembered something small and silver. But she didn't ask, and he didn't offer. Priscilla arrived shortly after, her suitcase by her side, ready to return to London. She found Hamish in the yard, throwing a ball for Lugs, who chased it half-heartedly. "You were right to look beyond the tidy explanation," she said, "no matter what Blair claims." Hamish shrugged. "I made it harder than it needed to be." She considered him with that cool gaze that never gave anything away. "You often do, but then, that is who you are." There was no warmth in her tone, but there was no malice either. He nodded, not trusting himself to answer. She left soon after, car crunching over the icy gravel, returning to her world of polite, controlled silences. That evening, Lochdu resumed its familiar rhythms, as if the village were relieved to have someone else's scandal to gossip about. Alec McLean stood outside Patel's shop, arms crossed, jaw set. "So, they cleared me," he said, when Hamish approached. "Took them long enough." "Aye," Alec grunted. "Folk will talk for weeks anyway, but at least your Blair isn't dragging me to court." "He's not my Blair." Alec's expression softened just barely. "You were wrong, Hamish, but you sorted it, in your own muddled way." Hamish didn't reply. He inclined his head and moved on. That night, back at the station, the peat fire burned low. Lugs curled against Hamish's leg with a sigh heavy enough to shake the boards. The ledger lay in one drawer, the pill tin in another. Both small reminders of choices Hamish had made. Little lies, small protections, quiet mistakes that had twisted the path of the case. Outside, the sky was clearing at last. The snow clouds drifted apart, revealing the dark shoulders of the hills. Hamish stared at them through the window. The new year had begun badly, with death and gossip and one error built upon another. But that was life in Lochdu. People muddled through. Sometimes they were forgiven, sometimes they weren't. He reached down and scratched Lugs behind the ears. The dog thumped his tail without lifting his head. "No triumph, boy," Hamish murmured. "Just another Hogmanay gone wrong." Lugs huffed in agreement. Hamish leaned back, listening to the wind settle outside, knowing the village would soon return to its usual quarrels and small grudges. They would never fully understand how close they had come to having their story written in the wrong way forever. And he would never tell them. That wasn't his style, and it wasn't their business. Tomorrow would bring more complaints, another minor crisis, someone shouting at Blair, and perhaps a letter from Davitt reminding him of proper channels. But tonight was quiet, uneasy, familiar. Hamish closed his eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the fire reach him at last.